Good morning and welcome to session 8 of our summer school, The Boy at the Back of the Class. The biggest part of today's session is going to be concentrating on some of the text big ideas through looking at the new vocab. And the success criteria for that is that you're going to use that vocabulary in sentences of your own. Okay, so we're going to be reading chapters 20 and 21 today, the Coldstream Guards and the Neighbours and the News. But before we do that, we're going to have a look at some of the vocab. Now, there's quite a lot of words here for you to look at, okay? And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 words, okay? So there's quite a few today. So that's why today's objective is that vocab. So let's have a look at the first word. Okay, so the word combat. So it's a noun and it's another word for fighting in a war is combat. So combat is a word that is particularly associated with war. So synonyms for that are battle, fighting, action and conflict. And there's an example there. These are trained combat officers. So these are people that are trained to fight in wars. The next word is trooper. So a trooper is a person or people who courageously face hardship and unpleasant conditions to achieve a goal. So, for example, you've got there the image of, I'm showing my lack of knowledge here, from Star Wars. I've forgotten what, stormtroopers, that's the word I was looking for, stormtroopers. So they're people who courageously face hardship and unpleasant conditions. So your mum might say to you, oh, you're such a little trooper, or your grandma or your granddad. Okay, so synonyms for trooper are heroes, determined, resilient people. So right, young troopers, in you go. There's your example. Transpired, that is a verb. And transpired means something happened or took place. Okay, so synonyms for transpired are happened, occurred, emerged, or materialised. It's quite a difficult word, that one, so let's have a look at it in a sentence. It transpired that the child in question wanted to hand in a note to the Queen, appealing for help on behalf of the refugee boy. So it happened, it just so happened that. Yeah, so transpired means something that happened or took place. Now, this is one of our big ideas today, and the word is immigrant. And there are different sorts of immigrants, and that's why this book is so important. So, for example, my dad was an immigrant. He was an immigrant from Ireland. So he came over to England from Ireland when he was about 17 years old, and he was an immigrant. And he came over here for work, but it was his personal choice, okay? Whereas some immigrants are refugees. They are people who have little choice about moving and they have arrived to escape hardships. So my dad had a choice. He was a sort of immigrant that just came to work. A refugee is something very different. So an immigrant is a noun, and an immigrant is somebody who has moved from another country because they chose to. Okay, so Ahmed isn't an immigrant because he chose to come. He is a refugee because he had very little choice but to move out of his country because of the war that was going on there. So synonyms for immigrants are migrants, emigrants, newcomer, foreigner, or alien. So the word foreigner and alien often have negative connotations. So there are quite a lot of people that don't like immigrants coming into our country. It's quite a controversial topic. So that's something to bear in mind as we go through the next few lessons. All I'm saying is that your child was nearly killed today for immigrant pests that want an easy life. Okay, so the next word we're going to look at is the word despicable. This is one of my favourite words, and you might recognise it from the film with Gru and the Minions, Despicable Me. But despicable is an adjective, and it's not a very good one. It's not a positive word whatsoever. If something or someone is despicable, they are not very nice at all. Okay. Synonyms for despicable are contemptible, loathsome, hateful, detestable. So despicable is quite an emotive word. It's a strong word. A despicable man, muttered Mum, clicking the extra bolt on the door shut. Bigotry. Now, this is definitely one of our big ideas today, and it's quite a difficult concept to grasp. Bigotry. Bigotry is a noun, okay, And bigotry is when people are intolerant to people who hold different views to themselves. So if someone who's a bigot doesn't want to listen to the viewpoint of somebody else who's got a different view. So for example, if so take the example of Ahmed. Some people are quite bigoted towards people who would quite happily allow Ahmed to be in the country if he needs to be. So bigots are when people are intolerant to people who hold different views to themselves. Okay, so synonyms for bigotry are prejudice, intolerance, racism, or discrimination. So the word there that you might be more familiar with is racism or prejudice, but someone who is bigoted is just someone who's intolerant of other people, particularly when it comes to certain views. And an example here is with his dinner jackets and silly necklaces trying to cover up his bigotry. Our last word today is intercepted. Intercepted is a noun, and it means when you intercept someone or something, you stop them from getting to where they were going. So intercepted means kind of like you block, okay? So synonyms for intercept are stop, grab, seize, block, obstruct, or impede. A 9-year-old child ran out and intercepted one of the Queen's cold-string guards. Okay, so those are today's vocab. So I'd like you to go to your booklet and have a go at using those words in your own sentences. Pause the video now. Okay, so let's have a read of chapters 20 and 21, the Coldstream Guards and the Neighbours and the News. When my brain woke up again and I opened my eyes, I was lying on something soft and could see a blur of flashing blue lights and lots of police cars everywhere. Right, let's get her in the ambulance, said a voice. Ooh, that's the first time we found out the gender of the narrator. Okay, so it's a girl. So, right, let's get her in the ambulance, said a voice. Tom was standing next to where my feet were. He was crying and saying friend a lot to London police officer, but standing behind him were 2 of the Queen's special guards. Forgetting that I had been frightened, I sat up and cried out, please, and realising the note was still in my hand, but all scrunched up now, I held it out to them and said, please, will you give this to the Queen? The London officer who'd been talking to Tom walked up to me. Now, you just calm down and take it easy. You did a dangerous thing today. These are trained combat officers, he said, pointing at the Queen's special guards. They're trained to stop anyone attempting to hurt the Queen. But we didn't want to hurt the Queen, sobbed Tom, and his face red and wet. We know that now, son, but we can't be too careful, can we, said the officer, his voice not as strict as it was before. One of the Queen's special guards came over to me. Let's have a look at this note then, shall we? He said gently, holding out his hand. I handed it to him and watched his face as he read it. Sometimes people won't tell you what they're really thinking, so you have to watch their face extra hard and see if they give any clues away. I didn't expect a special guard to do anything with his face, especially not one who worked for the Queen, but this one chuckled and then handed it over to the other special guard standing next to him, who had more medals on his chest. He smiled too. I don't know why, because it wasn't meant to be funny. This is what the note said. Dear Your Highness, Majesty Queen of England, we wrote you a letter on Friday about Ahmed, our friend who's a refugee boy, and put 3 stamps on it so the Royal Mail would get it to you faster. We've come to see you today because it's Wednesday already, and we thought the Royal Mail might have lost the letter, and as the gates are closing on Friday, it means we haven't got much time to find Ahmed's family and bring them here so they can all live together. We're outside the gates now. Tom's got brown hair and I've got dark brown hair, and we're in our school uniforms, which are dark blue and grey with pictures of a ship and a book on it so that you can see us easily. We can't stay later than 1:30 because if we don't get home at home time, then our mums and Tom's dad and Josie and Michael will worry. Please let us come and see you as soon as you finish your breakfast. Yours sincerely, me and Tom. P.S. We've got extra bags for tea. Hoping to have tea with the Queen there, were you? Asked the second special guard as he shook his head. Here, take a look at this, he said, passing the note to the police officer who was standing opposite. She read it and said, well, you don't see notes like that every day. A paramedic woman in a dark green onesie looked at the note too. Oh, sweet, she said. Then she made me lie down again and started pushing the bed onto an ambulance. But I don't want to go to the hospital. Please, no, I shouted, starting to feel scared. I don't like hospitals. The last time I saw Dad was when he was in hospital,
and I made a promise to myself that I wouldn't ever see one again, not ever. Don't worry, we won't take you to hospital unless we need to, darling, but I do need to check you're okay and that you don't have a concussion, said the paramedic calmly. She had long black hair that was tied into a ponytail and large brown eyes and an upside-down watch on her chest. Just lie here quietly for me for a few minutes, and we'll have you out and about in no time, she added, giving me a wink. The wink and her nice voice made me feel a little better, so I did what she said. After she pushed me onto the ambulance, the paramedic told me her name was Devinda and asked me all sorts of things, like how I was feeling and if I had a headache, and who Ahmet was and about my mum and dad. I told her about my dad and she said she was sorry. She held my wrist and checked my pulse and put a thermometer into my mouth and then said, I just need to check your heartbeat. But when she pulled up my school jumper, she stopped. Nice top, she said, her mouth suddenly looking as if it were tickling her. I looked down at myself and suddenly remembered that we had put on our best outfits for the Queen. It's my best top, I said, touching the shirt dotted with sparkling silver stars and gold planets for when we saw the Queen. Ah, grinned the paramedic Devinda as she opened the top 3 buttons and put a cold silver disc on my chest. Now, take a deep breath in and out. After listening for a moment, she nodded and said, You look and sound absolutely fine to me, ready to go, and I nodded. So she helped me down from the bed and held my hand as I got off the ambulance. In the distance, I could hear people cheering, but I didn't know why. Now, I think it's time for you two to get on home. Officer Martina is going to take you both home in that special car over there, said paramedic Devinda. She pointed to the London police officer, who was standing next to Tom and the 2 special guards. Behind her was a police car with flashing blue lights on top of it. Really? Asked Tom, his eyes lighting up. I was excited too, but then I remembered the note. But what about the Queen? And the note, I cried, looking up at everyone. If we don't give it to the Queen, then she won't know that we came and she won't know about Ahmet. Officer Martina smiled. Oh, I think she'll know you came all right, she said. The special guard wearing the most medals walked over to me and bent down so that his face was at the same level as mine. He had bright blue eyes and a large dimple in his cheek, just like Dad used to have. Only Dad had them in both cheeks, not just one. Her Majesty isn't here today, he said. She's actually in her other castle in Windsor. The Queen's got another castle? Asked Tom, looking horrified. Don't worry, I'll make sure she knows you were both here and that she gets this, the special guard held up the note. All right. Promise? I asked, suddenly feeling happy again. Like, really, really promise? You have my word, he nodded, and a Coldstream Guard never breaks their word. What's a Coldstream Guard? I asked, immediately imagining lots of them diving into freezing cold streams with their hats on. A Coldstream Guard is what we are, he replied, standing his back up straight. I'm Lieutenant Chris Taylor, and standing next to your friend Tom there is Second Lieutenant Walter Kungu. I looked over at the other guard, who was now giving us a salute. We're part of a very special force that protects both the Queen's houses and the country. Can you give her our presents too, then? Asked Tom. Presents? Said Officer Martina. Yeah, we got them for the Queen, explained Tom, pulling out the half-eaten packet of biscuits, the ruler, the packet of football stickers, and the squash box of fun from my rucksack. I'm afraid we can't take those, grinned Lieutenant Kungu, but we'll let her know about them when we give Her Majesty your note. Oh, okay, Tom shrugs, stuffing everything back into my bag. Now, kids, time to get you home, said Officer Martina. We've spoken to your school and your parents and have told them what happened. Oh, no, said Tom, twisting his hands. We're going to be in so much trouble. I nodded miserably. Don't worry, said paramedic Devinda. I'm sure they'll be happy just to have you back home and safe. And I think, she added, looking up at the helicopters, you might even be a little bit famous. Tom frowned at me and I frowned back because we were both wondering what could have made us famous. You two have a safe journey now, said Lieutenant Taylor. And next time you want to send the Queen a message, don't go running after us, any of us soldiers, said Lieutenant Kungu. A letter is more than enough. And giving Tom and me a nod and a salute, the Queen's special Coldstream Guards, who were now extra special to both me and Tom, marched off back towards the palace carrying the Queen's note. Right, young troopers, in you go, said Officer Martina, as a silver car with bright yellow and blue squares on its doors and a huge siren on the top stopped in front of us. Passing me a piece of folded paper, paramedic Devinda said, There's a special note for your mum to let her know you're completely fine, so make sure you give it to her, okay? I nodded. Bye then, smiled paramedic Devinda as she began to wave. You both take care of yourselves now. Getting into the back seat of the police car, we waved back. Lots of people also began cheering and waving at us from along the palace walls, so we waved back at them too, even though we didn't really know why. Tom got out a biscuit and started eating it. I took one too, but even though I was hungry, I couldn't eat it. My stomach felt all jumpy and twisty inside, and the closer we got to home, the more jumpy and twisty it became. There are some journeys you can't ever enjoy no matter how exciting they are, not even when you're in a real police car, because at the end of it, you know you'll be getting at least 100 detentions and probably won't be allowed any pocket money or chocolate for 10 years. But it was okay, because not even being able to have any chocolate ever again would be worth it if the Queen could help Ahmet find his mum and dad. That was all that really mattered. 21. The neighbours and the news. Sometimes grown-ups can be so confusing that they make you scratch your head. When Officer Martina took me home, Mum was the angriest I'd ever seen her before. At first it was scary because she kept shouting things like, "I can't believe you did this," and "What if something had happened to you?" But then she would hug me and hold me so tight that I thought my bones were going to be crushed. I wasn't quite sure if I was being told off or not. When she had calmed down, Mum made me hot soup and told me to tell her everything. So I told her about Ahmet's pictures and about what the man and woman on the bus had said about the gates, and the greatest idea in the world, and the emergency plan, and everything that had happened in front of the Queen's palace. Mum was quiet while I talked, and then, after I'd finished telling her everything, she sat still for a long time and didn't say anything at all. I was too scared to say anything else, so I sat on my hands and stared at the table. Finally, Mum opened her mouth to say something, but then the doorbell rang. "Who's that, I wonder?" Mum said. When she opened the door, Mrs. Gillingham, the neighbour who lived next door to Mrs. Abbey, was standing outside. She always wears a lot of necklaces and bright pink nail varnish and long dangly earrings. I like her because she smells of puff pastry, and at Christmas she always gives me a stocking filled with sweets. "Oh, hiya, love," cried out Mrs. Gillingham. She gave me a hug. "Thank goodness you're back safe and sound. But my, that was brave of you, wasn't it? The woman on the news said it was so you could help the refugees." "Sorry, Mrs. Gillingham," said Mum, frowning. "Did you just say that you heard about it on the news?" "Oh, it's all over the telly, all over it," said Mrs. Gillingham excitedly. "I'll expect you'll hear from the reporters soon." "Well, yeah, thank you for letting us know, Mrs. Gillingham." Mum started to close the door. "We'd better get some rest. It's been a long day." She waved Mrs. Gillingham out of the door and then looked down at me. The news. Just then the doorbell rang again. "Who is it?" called out Mum. "It's Mr. Rashid," came the man's voice. There was a loud "ouch" before I added, "I'm Mrs. Rashid." Mum looked at me in surprise and opened the door again. This time, exactly where Mrs. Gillingham had been standing, were Mr. and Mrs. Rashid. They live one floor below us and have twins. You can tell when they're home because they always leave the pushchair in the landing. It's too big to fit through the front door. We only ever see them in the lift or when they need help getting the pushchair out of the main door, but I like them, especially Mrs. Rashid, because she wears the brightest clothes. Once she wore a long flowing dress that had millions of tiny sequins on it and made her shine like a goldfish. She was always smiling and laughing with the babies, and Mr. Rashid likes to shout out the cricket scores to anyone he can find, but this was the first time they'd ever come to our flat. "Hello," said Mum. Mrs. Rashid held up her phone. "We've just read all about it," she cried, shoving it into Mum's hand and pointing to a news story with a picture of lots of palace guards standing around someone lying on the floor. "You were so brave. Now the Queen herself can't ignore what's happening to those families. I haven't slept for months thinking about it. Months. It makes me so angry. All those poor people with their little babies just trying to live. We send baby clothes and shoes whenever we can, but we don't have much money to spare," continued Mr. Rashid, his voice suddenly heavy and wobbly. "And now," Mrs. Rashid spotted me over Mum's shoulder and bent down. "Oh, you darling, please let me hug you." I hesitated for a moment. I don't always like being hugged, but Mrs. Rashid seemed nice, so I slowly walked over to her and let her hug me and then hugged her back. "If your refugee friend needs any help, any at all, please tell us," she said, touching my cheeks. "Yes." "Promise," said Mr. Rashid, his eyes big and serious. I nodded, because I knew Ahmet would probably like Mr. and Mrs. Rashid and wouldn't mind me asking them for help for him. "Good. Now you take care," grinned Mr. Rashid, as he and Mrs. Rashid turned away and headed down the stairs. "Well, this is turning out to be quite a day, isn't it?" laughed my mum, looking down at me and giving my shoulders a squeeze. But before she could close the door, Mr. Greg's huge head suddenly popped in. I took a step back and hid behind my mum, because I don't like Mr. Greggs at all, even though he always dresses in a suit and takes his hat off whenever he sees anyone he likes. I can tell Mum doesn't like him either, because she never says hello to him when we see him, and my mum always says hello to everybody. Even the man who sleeps in the doorway of Mr. Plex's flat on the corner of our road. "Yes, Mr. Greggs, what can I do for you?" asked Mum in her most polite voice. She only ever uses that voice when she talks to people she doesn't like Aunt Christina or the man with the clipboard who calls himself the landlord. Mr. Greggs cleared his throat and said, "I've just dropped by to say that your daughter there would do well to mind her own business. Those pesky refugees are only here because they want a piece of our benefits pie. She ought to know better, and you ought to have taught her better." I looked up at Mum's face and saw that it had gone as white as one of our dinner plates, as she stared at Mr. Greggs without blinking. "Have you finished?" she said, in a voice that was so cold I didn't recognise it. "All I'm saying is that your child was nearly killed today for immigrant pests that want the easy life without having to work a day for it. I mean, I know you're not exactly white, but you've been here long enough to know better, surely. Now that's an interesting point, isn't it, guys? Because we found out the narrator's a girl, and now we've been told that, I'm guessing from the description of Dad, that perhaps the narrator's of mixed heritage, because he says, I know you're not exactly white, but you've been here long enough to know better, surely. So I'm wondering if Mum comes from another country, or maybe Dad did as well. So there's definitely a sense that our narrator is of mixed heritage or from another country themselves. Mr. Greggs, that is quite enough, said Mum, her voice cold and formal. Her eyes had narrowed and her hands had become tight little balls. You and your views are not welcome here. Please leave. And taking a step back, Mum slammed the door shut just as loudly as she could do. She could, so 1 second Mr. Gregg was there, and the next second he wasn't. We could hear him ranting at us from the other side, but after a few seconds his voice started to get fainter and fainter. Despicable man, muttered Mum, clicking the extra bolt on the door shut, with his dinner jackets and his silver neckerchiefs trying to cover up his bigotry. Why is he so angry, Mum? I asked, slipping my hand into hers. And why did he call refugees pests? Because he's a heartless, selfish man who hates everyone far too much to want to help anyone, said Mum, even refugee children like Arnett. Oh, I said, wondering how anyone could hate someone who was running away from bullies and bombs. Mr. Greggs had clearly never met someone like Arnett before, because if he had, he could never have been so horrible about anyone who had to become a refugee. Now, let's forget about Mr. Greggs and go see what the news is saying about you, shall we? She ruffled my hair and then went and switched on the telly as I did a running jump onto the sofa. After a few seconds, a newsreader flashed upon the screen. Her voice was warm as she said, Today, an incident at Buckingham Palace added an extra few steps to the changing of the guard ceremony as 9-year-old child ran out and intercepted one of the Queen's Coldstream Guards. As she talked, the picture changed and I appeared on the screen, running out of the crowd and reaching up to touch a palace guard's arm with Tom just a few steps behind me. I looked so scared that it made me wonder how I had done what I did. I had never ever seen anyone I knew on television before, and it was the strangest thing in the world to not only see myself on it, but to have done something that the newsreader was talking about. It transpired that the child in question wanted to hand in a note for the Queen, appealing for help on behalf of refugee boys searching for his parents following their joint escape from the ongoing conflicts in Syria. We are expecting an official response from Buckingham Palace later this evening. Mum quickly flicked over to the next channel. Another newsreader was talking, and behind him was another picture of me, looking shocked and scared. The Queen's Guards had an unexpected encounter today, as a young child broke through the barriers during the famed changing of the guard ceremony. It is said the attack was made in protest against the government's poor handling of the refugee crisis. But I didn't attack anyone, I cried out. Mum nodded but didn't say anything, and instead switched the channel to another newsreader. The third newsreader confused me the most because it said, a 9-year-old child sparked a terrorist alert today after disturbing the changing of the guard ceremony and raising wider questions around security. Mum leaned over and turned off the sound. But I didn't want to hurt anyone, I said, trying not to cry. Why do they think I'm a terrorist? Mum sighed sadly and opening her arms pulled me towards her. There are lots of silly people in the world, darling. People who are so afraid of anyone who doesn't look like them or dress like them or eat the same food as them that they call other people, even children like you, all sorts of silly names. But I eat everything, I said, confused, except broccoli and baked beans, and what's wrong with what I wear? Nothing at all, said Mum, but they might still be scared of you because you don't look like them, she said, stroking my hand. So I'm scary, just because I look different, I added. Mum nodded. Yes, silly, isn't it? And I leaned back against my mum and fell into a deep thought. That's when your brain falls down into a giant hole in the middle of your mind and has to try and put all the pieces of thought together so that it makes sense. And because your brain is working so hard, you can't think or talk about or see anything else. All you can really do is think about the deep thought. And this is a really interesting part of any novel, which centres around like one central character or one or two central characters. It's the moment when the narrator kind of loses their innocence. So our narrator here had no clue that they may be treated differently because of the colour of their skin. Like, we didn't even know what ethnicity this child was, because we were reading it in first person with them. So this is the moment when this child realises that people might see them as different or other, or a threat or a terrorist just because of the colour of the skin. The deep thought my brain had found was wondering how anyone could be scared just of me just because I didn't look like them. Everyone in school looks different and likes different things and has parents who come from all different kinds of places. Tom's mum and dad came from different places in America, one called Florida and the other called California. Michael's mum comes from a place called Nigeria and his dad comes from France, which is why he always goes on lots of holidays and has even seen a giraffe and an elephant in the forest. Josie's mum comes from Barking and her dad comes from Bradford, which is why they speak differently, and her dad always sounds like he's asking a question, even when he isn't. And Mum and Uncle Lenny were both born in a faraway place I've never been to called Indonesia, and my dad was born in Austria. Mrs. Abbey once said that I was lucky to have parents from different places because it meant I never needed to go on holiday to get a suntan. I like looking like I have a suntan and like everyone being different. It would be too boring if everyone was exactly the same as each other. Mum, I asked, because the deep thought was starting to give me a headache. Does this mean that the Queen's Special Guards are scared of me too? Mum looked at me and asked, did they seem scared of you? No, I said after thinking hard. They were nice. Well then, she replied, stroking my hair, the thing you have to remember is that for every silly person who's afraid of you, there are at least 20 people who aren't silly at all. Okay, I said, feeling better. It was good to know that there were more nice people in the world than there were silly people in it. Just then, a face I knew popped up on the television screen. Mum, look, it's the taxi man, I shouted. He took us from the station to the Queen's Palace and he wouldn't take our money. Mum put the sound up and we both listened as a big red sign with Stan O'Connell, taxi driver, popped up underneath the pictures of his smiling face. They were just kids, he was saying cheerfully. Innocent kids, you know. A man next to him, it must have been the reporter because he was holding a microphone, said, and you didn't get the impression that they were planning any sort of protest or attack. Mum made an angry sound in her throat and I saw her shake her head. But Stan the taxi man smiled again and said, I didn't get the impression because that wasn't what happened. You can ask me another 5 times though, if you like. That made Mum burst out laughing, and she said she was glad I had met a cabbie who was as good and as funny as my Uncle Lenny was. Just then the phone started to ring. It was my Uncle Lenny checking to make sure I was okay. And after he rang, lots of other people rang too. But they weren't people we knew, they were reporters from newspapers. In the end, Mum turned the phone off and said it was time to put this adventure to bed, because tomorrow would bring it with a brand new adventure to go on. Mum let me go to bed a whole 30 minutes late that night because I wanted to watch the news again. Lots of people had taken pictures and videos of me running onto the road. It was strange seeing things that I hadn't been able to see for myself at the time, even though I'd been there and it had all happened to me. I hadn't realised how exciting it had been. As soon as I'd run out into the road, the police had started shouting and moving the crowd back and surrounded me in a big circle, and all the special guards had stopped playing their drums and trumpets and slammed the palace doors shut. It felt as if I were watching a movie starring somebody else, someone that looked like me, but wasn't me at all. I lay in bed that night trying to make sense of everything that had happened, but my brain felt fuzzy and tired, so in the end I gave up and closed my eyes. None of it really mattered anyway. What mattered was that we had given our note to the special guards, and they'd given us their word that they would tell the Queen about Ahmet. And just as soon as they did, she would send out her special guards to find Ahmet's family before the gates closed shut, and it was too late. Okay, so chapter 1 is a really interesting one for lots of different reasons. So you've got some discussion questions to think about in your booklet, but I want you to think about them quite in detail with everything we found out as well about the narrator. So, for example, that the narrator is a girl, that the narrator is got tan skin. We're still not quite sure of the ethnicity of the child, but certainly the sense that they're not white British. And I want you to think about why all of those things contributed to the chapter. So the first question is why do we think the incident made the news? So other than the fact that it was the Queen and they were attacking the guards at the Queen, why does it make such an interesting story? Why are so many neighbours coming to the door? So obviously one of the neighbours that's come has not been very polite, but why has Mr. and Mrs. Rashid come to the door? What is it about them that people that they've never spoken to other than just passing in the hallways and when helping with the pram, why have they come to the door? What has made the neighbours want to go and speak to the family? What do you think of Mr. Greggs? Mr. Greggs cleared his throat and said, I've just dropped by to say your daughter there would do well to mind her own business. Those pesky refugees are only here because they want a piece of our benefits pie. So what do you think about Mr. Greggs? Perhaps you agree with him, and all opinions are valid. So what do you think about Mr. Greggs? Do you think he's right? Do you think he's wrong? Think about him in relationship to Ahmet as well. Is Ahmet a pesky refugee who's just here for benefits? And what information did we find out about the narrator? Maybe there's something that I've missed that you noticed that I didn't spot. So how do you think the narrator feels knowing that people are scared of her because she has a different skin colour? So I'm scary just because I look different. And Mum nodded, yes, silly, isn't it? So what have we found out about the narrator today? That's really, really interesting. And last but not least, why is it important to have people who come from different places and have different cultures? So, for example, if my dad hadn't emigrated from Ireland and come over here, I wouldn't be the head of English at the studio school. I wouldn't be here at all reading the story to you. So I'm half Irish. I was raised half Irish. So I like Irish food. I was an Irish dancer. I learned to play the penny whistle when I was a child. I did ceilidh dancing. I was raised Irish. So even though my family come from a country that's just next door to ours, I am from a different culture. So why is it so important to have people who come from different cultures and different places? What does it add to our society that we've got lots of different people here? Okay, so maybe just make some notes on those in the box. So remember, when you're writing in the box, you don't have to write in full sentences. Just put some notes about your thoughts about that. I'd be really looking forward to reading those. Okay, so today's exit tickets, you've got 3 questions to answer. 1, what did the neighbours think of the narrator's attempt to give the Queen her letter? What information did we find out about the narrator's mum in the last chapter? So what we found out about the narrator's mum. And how do we think Ahmet felt when he saw the narrator on the news? Okay, so how do you think Ahmet's going to feel when he sees this on the news and knows that now everyone knows about him and his struggle to find his parents? Okay, thank you very much, guys, and I'll see you tomorrow for session 9.